All right, so why don't you start by telling us your name and your position at Michigan Language Assessment and what you do in that role?
Mhm. So my name is Tahnee Bucher. I'm an assessment developer here at Michigan Language Assessment. I've been with the organization since October of 2022. After almost 2 decades of teaching English as a foreign language and teaching English as a second language as well, and then being highly involved for about like 7 to 8 years in classroom assessment and then language proficiency testing. So here at MLA, in my role, I help ensure that our tests continue to be valid, reliable, fair, and also accessible to test takers everywhere, right? So a big part of what I do is to help support the development and the enhancement of all of our test products, primarily through thorough item reviews, test form reviews, test creation, item performance analysis, quality assurance processes. And I also help support and contribute to research. We have a big research program here at MLA, and I help with that as well. And I'm also a member of the malpractice committee, where we discuss and evaluate test misconducts. So quite a lot of things
Yeah,
that yeah.
yeah, it sounds like a lot goes into your role. What would you say your favorite part of your role is?
So, well, so I'm involved in a lot of things, right? And so, in my role, I am able to make meaningful contributions toward the advancement of quality, of test content, of processes, of services within the organization and beyond the organization. I am provided with like ample opportunities for professional development and continuous learning. I get to be involved in like research about technology and using innovative techniques to be able to create more efficient and more effective language proficiency tests. I work with a great team of experts, like other linguists, psychometricians. But if I have to choose like a favorite part of my job and what I always think about when I'm doing what I'm doing, whatever it is help test takers achieve or get closer to achieving their goals, right? One step closer. Knowing that my job and what I do and how well I do my job will impact somebody else's language learning journey and their opportunities. That's like the most fulfilling part. And that's actually what I wanted to be doing. Because so as a teacher, you have that impact as well, right? And that's what I did for 18 years. But being part of an organization that where I help create tests that will impact somebody else's future, right? That will help them get one step closer to pursuing that higher education program abroad or getting a promotion at a job, that's very fulfilling. And also because I was once a test taker like that, because I'm originally from Brazil, and I also had to take a language proficiency test to be able to pursue my graduate studies in the United States. So I can speak from the perspective of somebody who was a test taker themselves and knew the importance of like, I need this test to be able to tell whoever is using this test that I know, what my ability in English is, right? And then from the perspective of a teacher and of an assessment developer, I know the importance of helping construct tests that are effectively measuring somebody's ability in English, right? Because you don't want a test that doesn't mean anything or a score that doesn't mean anything. You want something that will be able to say, oh, yes, I understand. I got this score. I need to improve a little bit more. I need to keep working. Or, great, I got a score that shows me that I actually know how to speak English and I have the ability to, pursue higher education in the United States or, get that promotion in my job. And so I think this is in my core, that's like what I'm thinking about every day. Like I'm reviewing this item. I want to make sure that it's fair and that it's going to be like the best item that it can be for that test taker who will be taking this test and it will be fair to them. And so I think MLA places a very strong emphasis in equity and fairness in language assessments, and then trying to make the best test for the diverse population of test takers that are out there taking our tests, right? And I get to be part of that. I get to help all these test takers, achieve their dreams. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, it's certainly very fulfilling, and it sounds like it's a cool opportunity for you specifically, knowing that you had English as a second language yourself. So that's really cool. And so moving forward, we're talking about your dissertation. So
Mhm.
tell us, I guess, like the title of your dissertation, like the logistics of it. What was it for? Where did you submit it?
Mhm. So I pursued my doctoral degree at the University of Arizona in the program of second language acquisition and teaching. And so my dissertation was submitted to fulfill the requirements for the degree of a Doctor of Philosophy in second language acquisition and teaching. And my focus of like throughout my graduate studies was in second language pedagogy, social cultural studies, and assessment, language assessment. And so the title of my dissertation is Assessing Language Assessment Literacy in University and College Administered Intensive English Programs. And the reason for intensive English programs was that because it was the context that I was very familiar with and very like involved throughout all my years in the United States. So I was researching particularly that particular setting, but we can talk about it.
Yeah, and so I got a chance to look through your dissertation. I think something that would be helpful to establish when we're talking about this, and maybe you can explain for viewers, for people reading, what is language assessment literacy, and why do you feel that it's so important?
So I think actually before we start talking about language assessment literacy per se, I think we need to talk about assessments in general, and not only like language proficiency tests, like any type of assessment, right? And to actually discuss the power that assessments have. Assessments carry consequences, all types of assessments, and that's how decisions are made about us in the world is based on the tests that we take. Whether we like them or not, those decisions are based on tests, right? You start school, you start taking tests, and that goes throughout your entire life, right? Including job interviews, which is a type of test as well, right? So thinking of the power that assessments hold, there's actually one researcher that I think captured this very precisely. It was Norris in 2008, and then they talk about how on the basis of assessments, the students will be placed, they will be promoted, they will be encouraged, but they can also be kept denied access. They could be discouraged, right? They could be misled, misplaced. Teachers will be hired, encouraged, supported, or they may not have their contracts renewed, right? Institutions will get funding, or maybe they will not get funding based on the results of assessments, right? Policymakers will know what's going on. The public, the general public will know how things are, or maybe they will just be deceived and not really know the true how things really are and what, like, in terms of like, do they really reflect student learning, right? And so thinking that assessments carry all these consequences, right? And unsound assessments or inaccurate assessments, unfair assessments, they lead to poor decision making. So if you have bad assessments, if you have unsound assessments, you're going to have unsound decisions. You're going to have poor decisions made on the basis of those assessments. And to think that, like I said, decisions that are made in the world about us are based on assessments, you want those decisions to be fair, right? You don't want it to disadvantage any group of test taker. You want to make sure that no group of test takers is being disadvantaged in any in any stage of the process. Like, for example, if you think about it, from all the way from creating the item to putting the item on a test, developing the test, administering the test, scoring the test, using the test score, you want to make sure that the entire process is fair, right? And based on sound decisions, right? And on best practices. And so that's where language assessment literacy comes in. Because if you do not have the knowledge, the skills, the abilities, the principles to be able to carry out all these stages of the process, how can you ensure that the end result is representative, is meaningful, is fair, right, of the test taker's ability, whatever that test is. It doesn't really need to be a language proficiency test, right? So language assessment literacy is the knowledge, the skills, the ability, the principles to be able to carry out all stages of the process, right? And to be able to make informed and ethical. I think the ethical part of it is like, it's a big thing for me. I think I relate assessment to social justice a lot. And so the ability to make ethical and informed decisions throughout the entire process is based on language assessment literacy. Right?
Yeah. I was just thinking as you were talking about the gravity of language assessments, is there anything in place currently for reviewing, I guess, like you were saying, the unsoundness of something, the unfairness of something? Is there a way that we can review language assessments?
Oh, yes, and that's what we do on a daily basis here,
Yeah.
right? Because so we are following best practices that come from research, right? That come from like sound research based on like test results and based on what does it mean to say that you're measuring language proficiency? What does it mean to say that your somebody is a C2 or a B1 on the CFR scale, right? So we do this as a testing organization and the assessment team, we do this on an hourly basis. Everything that we do is guided by all those best practices in the field to make sure that our test is biased for best. It's not a tricky test. It's not a test that will disadvantage any test taker that, for example, does not have any knowledge of this particular culture, right? So when we're doing item reviews, we're making sure that, okay, will all test takers be familiar with this, or will some test takers be at an advantage because they are familiar with whatever concept that we're talking about, and therefore will do better. We want to make sure that we have an equal playing field, right?
Right.
So
Yeah. We don't want to
right.
question about like a snowstorm to somebody who's never experienced snow before.
Correct. Or any, like, if you go in the very basics, right? Holidays, right? Things that assume some cultural understanding, or even it goes like, you can have like cultural bias, vocabulary bias, and all sorts of things that can creep into the tests and the test administration and test scoring, like even like who the raters are. That's why we have quality assurance processes. We want to make sure that all of our raters are calibrated and they know, okay, we're using this rubric. We have an objective rubric. Is everybody rating their, like, the performance, be it written, be it spoken? Are they all evaluating those in the way that they're supposed to be evaluating? So that's why we have those. So basically, like, we breathe all these assessment practices every single day in every single thing that we do.
Yeah. So why don't you summarize for us the topic of your dissertation? Give us sort of for somebody who wouldn't understand language assessment, a summary that they could maybe digest.
So keep in mind, the context of my dissertation was not the context of a language proficiency test organization, like large scale, like we're talking like MLA, any other like big testing organizations. The context was intensive English programs in the United States, higher education. And the reason for that is because I was looking at that context in particular because it is also a high stakes context for international students, right? And so let's take a step back here. So my dissertation, what did I look at? I was interested in finding out about the levels of language assessment literacy of language teachers, in this case, English as a second language teachers in the context of intensive English programs within universities and colleges in the United States, and the levels of language assessment literacy of the directors of said programs, right? I was examining their attitudes toward language assessment. Do they support professional development, for example, in language assessment? Are they interested in learning more about language assessment, right? And also their preparedness to assess students. But then you may be asking yourself, like, why are you like even asking that? Why are they not prepared? to test students. And that's where the research comes in. And I have to tell you that not necessarily. And why? Well, back in the day, let's put it like in the 70s or something, right? At some point, it was decided that, well, if you're a teacher, if you know how to teach, you know how to test. And that is not necessarily the case. You may be an excellent teacher, but you may not know how to create a good test that will show you how much your student knows. And so the reason for that being that because there was this idea, this inaccurate idea that if you know how to teach, you know how to test, not a lot of emphasis was given to language assessment in teacher preparation programs, right? And so you have all these teachers being trained on how, like, many teaching methods and like knowing how to be a good teacher. But when it comes to accurately measuring students' achievement of learning outcomes, they didn't know how to do that. And that's what the research showed. And so but this is like for assessment in general. And then I'm talking about grade school in the United States, research in Europe and in other places. That's what the research was showing for education in general, not only language education, right? So my idea was to see, is this true for language teachers, right? Are ESL teachers knowledgeable when it comes to language assessment, right? So I really wanted to see, because and so part of my experience at at my job at the University of Arizona, I was in charge of providing feedback to teachers on their assessments. And I was seeing a lot of different things, and things that were not necessarily best practices. And not because people did it on purpose, it's just that they didn't know how to do it better, right? And so I wanted to see, in the context of the United States, how assessment literate those professionals are. So basically, this is what I studied in my dissertation. I investigated through questionnaires and interviews whether the teachers and the language program directors, how they perceived the language assessment literacy levels to be, their attitudes toward language assessment, their preparedness to do whatever tasks they had to do. Like for the teachers, the tasks would be slightly different than the tasks that an administrator would have to have with regards to the assessments, and the motivations for them to become more language assessment literate, if they were motivated, and the challenges that they encountered in doing so. So that was the big picture goal of my dissertation.
And so your two kind of populations that you interviewed, so you have your language teachers and then the directors of the programs.
Correct.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what did you find in interviewing them? What was something maybe that was surprising to you? Something that you were like, yeah, that makes sense. I could have predicted that. What was your data like that you found?
So I think the most, like, if I could summarize, like, one of the most surprising things to me was that 90% of them said, well, I have a good enough assessment knowledge. I consider myself assessment literate, right? So it's like, I was like, that is a bit odd, because I was not really expecting that, given the research, like I said, that said lack of poor formal training. You maybe have one course in assessment during your master's program, or maybe like assessment is shoved into like a methods class for like a couple of classes, and that a methods course and a couple of classes, they talk about assessment and that's it. So like, I was not expecting people to say, like the great majority of people to say, I'm assessment literate. Like, I know I have the tools necessary to do my job. But then when you start digging, right, and you start seeing their responses, the majority of people also said, oh, I only had basic training on assessment. And so it was interesting to see how they only had basic training, but they reported, because this was self-reported, right? So like, they reported despite the fact that they only had basic training, they reported themselves as being assessment literate. And a lot of the participants, I noticed this trend. The ones that knew more, that like when I was doing their interview and they were like explaining to me all sorts of things that I was asking about assessment, they said, well, there is a lot that I don't know. I know that there's a lot that I don't know. And these were the people who knew the most. Now, the people who didn't know, it's like, I don't know what I know. No, I don't know. And actually, somebody actually said that in one of the interviews, like, I don't know what I don't know. And so within that universe, they thought that they knew. And part of the reason for that could be attributed to the fact that a lot of the professional development that is given to teachers about language assessment is usually geared toward the very basic, or the person who has no knowledge. And so the teachers who already have some knowledge, they keep getting stuck, because how do you go from here to here if all that you're being given is here still? And so that's a big problem with professional development for in-service teachers in that particular context. So I thought that it was interesting to see. But I was also happy to see that contrary to a lot of what happens in general education, there is a lot of understanding these days, especially because, I mean, if we look at like language assessment literacy research, it only started to take flight. You'll probably find this surprising, but like, given how important it is, late 2000, and then like early 2010, right? So this is fairly new. In discussing assessment literacy, assessment in general education started back in like the 70s, but took flight in the 90s. So it's a little bit older. But in language assessment literacy per se, it's fairly recent, right? But despite that, and despite, like I said, lack of formal training in master's programs, because master's is usually the terminal degree for ESL teachers in that context. Despite that, the fact that graduate programs typically devote like little time, like I said, in basic professional development, people are interested, and people are starting to see how impactful assessments are, right? Imagine, like, for example, Rachel, if you are an international student in an intensive English program, right? And you have an oral communication class. Your teacher only gives you written assessments, and then you fail the class. Who's at fault? You or the teacher who's giving you writing assessments to assess your spoken ability, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of the times with international students, depending on how many classes you fail or depending on your grades, you get sent home. You're not allowed to stay in the United States, and you're not allowed to progress in your studies, right? So you as a teacher, you hold a lot of power in your hands. Like, you literally may be sending somebody home. There's actually one researcher that said a lot of the things that goes wrong with our tests, we have to admit it's our fault, like the developers, not the test takers' fault. And so if we move that into, as a language testing organization that we have that responsibility. It's in our hands, you know. If something goes wrong with the test, is most likely our fault. So we need to make sure that we are creating the best tests possible, right? And so should teachers, right?
Was there I'm curious if there was a demographic trend for, like you were saying, teachers that were reporting that they felt confident in their assessment abilities. Was there a trend?
Yes, unfortunately, to be expected, larger institutions with more resources. Usually those larger institutions with more resources will also have an assessment coordinator position that will guide teachers and that will provide teachers with training. And so that is all tied to being more assessment literate, right? And then those larger institutions as well are able to provide. So when I talk about resources, I'm also talking about time, and whether you're full-time or whether you're an adjunct instructor, you know, or whether you get money for professional development or not, you know. So it's tied to, it's like sort of like Marlow's like pyramid of needs, right? Like,
yeah, yeah.
Like, assessment is not really like the first basic need,
right?
You know? So it's just, and actually, sad enough, I had one of the questions was to rate the importance of language assessment. Nobody rated language assessment as first. Like, something else was always first. Classroom management or methods or something else. But assessment was never first, no matter what the institution was.
Interesting.
But,
That's
but it's
surprising.
getting better. It's getting better. Like I
That's
felt
good.
optimistic after finishing this dissertation, you know.
Good. So can you walk me through the conclusion of your research? Did you find that maybe there's a lack of formal training, poor background knowledge, in the kind of language assessment realm?
Yes. So one of the main conclusions is, yes, graduate programs are still lacking classes and courses that are offered to pre-service language teachers, right? Who also often go and work for testing organizations, like just like MLA, right? Most of our background is in teaching, right? And so there is lack of formal training at that stage, but it's getting better. But the other thing is too is that it's been very hard for research to determine what exactly consists, like language assess, like what topics should be focused on in these classes, right? And this leads me to the second part of my research findings, was that depending on the type of stakeholder you are, you will need different assessment knowledge. So for example, I'm a teacher. I will need knowledge of being able to construct a test that will accurately reflect the student's achievement of the learning outcomes in my class. I do not necessarily need how to put together a language proficiency test, right? Because I'm not putting together a language proficiency test. All I want to know is whether my students achieved what I taught them in the class, right? So teachers have a certain type of knowledge, and they will need certain types of skills and abilities to be able to do what they need to do. Program administrators need to know what to do based on this. They don't need necessarily to know how to put together a test, but they need to understand what the scores mean, because they're going to be placing students, they're going to be writing recommendation letters for students, right? They're going to be placing students in another program, right? They're going to be using the test scores. Here, as a language testing organization, as assessment developers, we need to know other things. We need to know how to put together a language proficiency test that will be practical, you know, because you cannot test absolutely everything, right? So we need to make a test that is practical, that can be done within a certain time constraint. We need to know how to make the test reliable. We need to know to measure, okay, we're doing this to assess this because this will tell us this, right? Based on the test taker's score. The organizations that we work with that are accepting our scores, those people need to know what our scores mean to be able to use those scores, right? Because what if we say, okay, this test taker got a B2, I don't know, 35. What do you do with that if you're the person receiving the score, right? Can you make a decision, right? Are you going to say, oh, if you, let's say you're somebody who works for a university, right? And say you look at that score and say, okay, I think based on this score, you need 1 year still of remedial English classes before you start your general ed classes at the university. Or no, yay, you got a great score. You got to move on to start your general ed classes, for example. Or you are a professional organization, and then you receive that test score and say, okay, oh yes, you can get this promotion, right? And so every stakeholder has a different need for assessment, right? And because of that, and because of the tasks that they perform, they need different knowledge, skills, and abilities. And sometimes they will overlap, right? Language teachers need to know about reliable and valid tests, so do we, right? But we need to know a lot more than a language teacher would need to know. And so I think that was the second biggest thing in my research, is delineating those profiles. What does an administrator need to know, right? What does a teacher need to know? And that can be expanded onto all sorts of stakeholders. And this is something that the research has been focusing on in the past, I want to say, because we discussed like, oh, this is actually, fortunately, the research is growing, and it is. And there is this focus on different stakeholders, including even policymakers, like people who in the government who are making decisions, right? And so I think these were like the main takeaways. Yes, we're still lacking formal training, but we're getting there, slowly but surely we're getting there. And then we're discussing, and people are talking a lot more about it, because if you think about the context that we're living now, migration is the norm pretty much, right? And then like the ability you have to function in multilingual settings has increased like exponentially, right? So how do you effectively measure somebody else's proficiency? And so assessment has been brought to this, thankfully, has been brought to this in the spotlight. And we're talking about these things from classroom assessment to large scale tests, because we hold responsibilities in our hands, right?
And how does the development of a standardized language assessment differ from the development of any other standardized test? Like, what special steps are involved in that?
Oh, so you're talking about like in education in general?
Yeah, so yeah, just like any other standardized tests that you would have in like math or English, or like how does a language proficiency, I guess, assessment differ in its development?
So I think actually I would start with the similarities, right? So
Mm.
there's like the basic principles of, you have a construct. So what do you want to measure? You want to measure language proficiency. How are you going to go about that? Like, how are you going to measure that? And so you have to decide which test items will tell you whether the person knows how to use the language, right? So let's say let's compare it to a math test. Let me try to think of an example off the top of my head here. But like if you give like a math test and you want to know if they can do addition, and you ask them to do subtraction, that is not telling you whether they can do addition, right? So the same thing with language proficiency tests. You want to make sure that the items that you have put together will tell you what you need to know about somebody's language ability, right? And you need to know that the test is valid, it is measuring what it's supposed to be measuring, it is reliable. So every test administration, if you give that test, it will give you similar results, right? That it's a reliable test, it is fair. So I guess in broad strokes, like we have to follow certain specs, and we have to follow guidelines in order to make sure that all of our test forms are parallel, right? We cannot have one test form that is much harder than the other, because then what's the validity of this, right? So we need to take steps that all standardized tests need to have to make sure that, okay, if a test taker took this test last year and another test taker took the test this year, are their scores comparable? Do they mean the same thing, right? So these are things that we need to do. What else do we need to do? I had something else that I was going to say. So like following guidelines, following best practices to make sure, and then analyzing statistically, and keep going back to the test, right? And making sure that, is there anything off with it? Like, why does this item seem to be super easy? And then, can we evaluate that? And so there's a bunch of different processes that are involved in the development of a test. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. Standard settings, right? This is something that we have to make sure that all of our tests are aligned with the scales that we're using, right? And making sure that they are all according to the standards that we have. And that's a standard test, right?
It's so interesting. So much goes into developing a language assessment that people just don't know about. It is a really involved process from what I've gathered so far. It's very fascinating.
I love it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It definitely, like, item development is, I think, the most interesting to me, how they come up with topics. And so
bunch of like different stages of reviews, right? We have like
yeah, so many reviews.
Review.
Yeah.
We have another review, like a content review, and then like one review to say, okay, is this flowing well? Does this have correct, accurate information? Does this not? Will this favor this test taker but not this test taker? Is it going to be accessible to all? So there's a lot that goes into it, and a lot of eyes, like
Yeah.
from the very beginning until the very end, like an item will probably be seen by 10, 12 people, if not more.
So there's so many review stages, which is a good thing.
Mhm.
We want that.
And not a luxury that classroom teachers have. Because classroom
Right.
teachers usually just, it's one and done. Maybe like next year when they teach the same class again, they will go back to that test, right? And then here, no, it's a constant review of every single step of the process, right? So
Yeah. And thinking about teachers, what do you think they struggle the most with when it comes to assessment?
to make sure that they are actually testing what they're supposed to be testing. Like for example, if you want to know test takers' reading ability, right? You would probably give them a passage to read and ask questions about that passage, right? But sometimes teachers try to test a skill instead of testing it directly. Like, what is the skill? The skill is the ability to read. Can you read and show me that you've understood, right? They will use indirect measures to test something, and that doesn't necessarily show to what extent the test taker can do what they're supposed to do. Like, for example, I don't know if they can, if you're trying to test their ability to read, but then you're asking them to figure out how to put a sentence together, that does not mean that they know how to read. Like the ability of like, can you identify what the main detail of this, the main idea of this passage is? Can you identify the details? So I think teachers, a lot of the times they end up testing things that are not directly related to the construct of what they need to be testing. Or they have subjective rubrics, for example. Like, for example, if you include creativity, for example, in your rubric, right? Very subjective. Like, what is creative for you, Rachel? It may be very different what I think is creative for me. But we can both agree whether their grammar is correct or not, right?
Right.
So including categories in rubrics that are very subjective, that is dependent upon the rater as opposed to what is actually in front of you, objectively speaking, that is also a very common mistake. Right.
Is there any benefit to having subjectiveness in language assessment, or should it all be very objective?
My personal opinion, I think we should try for it the more objective, the better, because then it goes back to the concept of being equal, like having equity and being fair, right? Because if you introduce elements that are very subjective, then how can you ensure that all the scores, like for example, if you got a score of 30, I got a score of 30 in different categories, right? Do they mean the same thing? And we want to make sure, especially for a language proficiency test, that our scores mean what they're supposed to mean, right? Not what Rachel as the rater thought it was creative or interesting versus Tahnee as the rater thought it was creative or interesting, right? So striving for objectivity with something that is highly subjective like language, right, is, I think, the best way to make sure that you are ensuring like a fair process, right?
Right. And what do you think we can do to improve teachers' language assessment literacy?
One, be talking about it, because a lot of the times teachers, in the context that I studied, they take it very personally, like, oh, are you saying my test is bad? It's like, no, we're not like judging your personality or anything or your ability to teach. We all know that we were not trained to, create tests. And so talking about it is the first step with everything, I guess, right? So addressing the matter, people need to be better assessment literate, period, everywhere. And not only teachers, the directors as well, because they need to recognize when their teachers are not assessment literate, because then they have to say, your assessments are not fair. You're testing them on something that you're not supposed to be testing them on, or you're testing something that is completely unrelated, right? And so, and that goes for every single stakeholder. And I think if I can tie this back to MLA, and to other big testing organizations, our responsibility goes beyond just developing tests that are valid, reliable, and fair. Our responsibility is to ensure or try to help as much as we can the stakeholders that we are involved with, for them to understand what it is that they are seeing when they get a test score from us. Because it doesn't matter if we have the best test in the world that is truly and effectively and accurately showing how much a test taker knows, if that score is being misused, if that score is not used as intended. And so it is everybody's responsibility to improve everybody's assessment literacy. And like I said, regarding their specific profiles, right? You don't need to know as much as I know on the assessment team, but you like as part of MLA, you also need to know what does, certain things to be able for you to be able to market our test, right?
Yep.
You need to understand, okay, so when we say our test is valid and reliable, what does that mean? Right? So everybody's responsibility, because we have people's fate in our hands in a way, So I think it's everybody's responsibility too. And to improve language assessment literacy, right? And like I said, there's so much research being done these days, and really trying to delineate what it is that people need to know depending on what kind of tasks that they have, and really trying to keep up with the research. Because you see, so for language, I don't know how familiar you are with like language teaching methods, but like in the past, how did people teach languages, right? Well, it was like grammar translation. Basically, you just have a sentence, you see a sentence in the language that you're trying to learn, you translate that to your language, right? That's how it was used to be taught. But then as methods progressed, and then the focus shifted to communication. So we're learning how to communicate. So language should be used for social purposes. So just being able to translate is not enough. You need to be able to use language in context, right? But when you have these improvements in the methods, or like these advances in teaching methods, assessment should go hand in hand. And a lot of the times it doesn't. It's always a step back, because there's so much more research into teaching than it is into assessment, right? So we need to keep up. We need to keep up with what's going on in the teaching and how we understand language, right? So what is the purpose of language? Is it to be able to successfully communicate? Okay, does our test reflect that? Does our test capture whether a test taker can successfully communicate? And that's why we have tasks like write a letter convincing somebody of this, which is an act of communication, right? Or let's discuss, like in ACP, we have the speaking prompts where like we have these candidates and we have to discuss which one is the best for this particular task that we want them, this fictitious character to do, right? Can we convince one another of what we think? Are we able to accomplish these communicative tasks? So we need to make sure that our tests are going hand in hand. And the only way you do that is by enhancing assessment literacy. You understand where you are, and you understand where things are going, and then you try to make everything better, right? And it's a never-ending job.
Yeah, it's always changing, and there's always room for improvement. And so how does your research currently from your dissertation inform your role here at MLA?
I think in two ways, mainly. One of them is making me more assessment literate, and I'm one of the ones that say, there's just so much more to know. I know that there is a lot out there that I need to know. So by conducting this research and really digging into like aspects of assessments and how to make a sound assessment, right? That made me more assessment literate, and that I can bring that knowledge back to the organization and say, I think we should be doing this and not this, or I can see the flaws in this, or I can say, oh no, this is great. We are doing a great job in this aspect, in this area, right? So I can contribute to, like I said in the beginning, helping continue to ensure that the tests are, because the tests are moving parts, right? So items are being created every single day. So you need to make sure that the tests continue to be good, but pretty much. And so I think I bring that knowledge from having worked on this, and then from having done the research and study this, I can bring that technical knowledge to the organization, and that informs my role here. But having done this research, I think it opened my eyes to how important it is that everybody involved is assessment literate, like I've said many times during this talk with you. And so like effectively communicating with the stakeholders and making sure that, you know, they understand the test and like how can we on our end make a score report more understandable? What kind of information can we send to stakeholders to help them for like selling purposes too? Like can they use our test for their purpose? Because if they can't, if our test is not telling them what they need to know, then they shouldn't be using your test. They should be using another test. I don't know, right? So, but it is our responsibility to ensure that just everybody's informed, right? You know, like there are tests, there are many language tests for many different purposes, and we do not create all of them. You know, there are some tests out there that are different than the ones that we have, but we want to make sure that we continue to have the tests that we have the best that they are and like as reliable as valid for the purposes that they're going to be used, right? And so it's important that we have this alignment, and the only way for you to have this alignment is for everybody involved to know what the product is, right? So I guess that's how it informs my role. Like I again mostly in mainly these two ways.
And what I know you said in recent years more research has been done. Does any of it build on what you found? Does any of it relate to what you found?
Yes. I see a lot these days of people trying to, because remember when I talked about the profiles for a different stakeholder, right? This started off in 2000, I want to say 2013 with Taylor. And since then, there has been a lot more research because so teachers are central stakeholders, and that has been the focus that had been the focus of the research. But nowadays, because Taylor was the first one to put forth this idea of different linguistic profiles. People are basing on it like I did. Like it was like I expanded it to English program directors, but there are people looking at policymakers, university personnel. And so I think a lot of research is building on that original research on trying to establish what it is that each person in the system needs to know and needs to be able to do to be able to make ethical and informed decisions. Right?
Fantastic. Well, do you have any other tidbits that you'd like to add on?
I think, like I said in the beginning, if everybody in our field, and I'm not only talking about MLA and this organization, but if we all think and constantly have that in the back of our head, the importance of assessments and the consequences that assessments have, and how well everybody does their job will impact someone's life, and keep that in mind, I think it makes it for growth and development and justice, you know, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you are creating tests and you are assessing people and you have a true measurement of their ability so that they can make the best decision that they can based on that, you know, and understand that that is a very important part of their lives. I wouldn't be here today had I not gotten the score back in 2009, you know.
Right.
So how would my life have been different had I not taken this English proficiency test and not studied in the United States, you know? So it's a really high stakes job, you know, like we often think of like medicine and engineers, right? But I like to think that what we do, you know, help form engineers and doctors, you know, and
Language is the base of every job. So,
correct,
yeah.
right? And so you want to make sure that, you know, everybody's thinking about the user, you know, and then making sure that there is transparency, there is, you know, reliability, there is validity, there's fairness and equity throughout the entire process, you know, from us developing items, reviewing items, to the person who's rating in the centers, in the test centers abroad, to the operations person here who's collecting the scores to sending the test results to the person in the job or in the organization, in the university, looking at those scores, to the teacher who's going to be receiving, I don't know, maybe those scores as well. So I think it's very important that we all do better, everybody.
For sure. And then remind me again, so you came to the United States. Where were you originally from?
So I'm from Brazil originally.
Brazil. Okay. And what was your just 'cause I'm always curious when people say that they came from another country, what was your motivation for coming to the US?
So back when I was in Brazil, like in high school, I thought that I wanted to be a Portuguese language teacher, but then I also knew English, and I realized that, well, if I become an English teacher, I can travel and live abroad as well. And so that was one of my goals. So in college, my major was English language and literature, and I did that in Brazil. And then the next step was like, well, I want a master's degree, and I didn't want to get it in Brazil. I wanted to come to the United States and do that. So in 2009, I moved to the US to go to school here. And I pursued my master's degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages, TESOL. And then after that, and so I was teaching international students from all sorts of backgrounds in the intensive English program at the university that I got my degree in. I also taught Portuguese as a foreign language to American students, which was really fun. It was for the first time I was teaching Portuguese, so it was interesting to do. And
is that your native language, Portuguese?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then after that, I got a job at the University of Arizona, and I was also accepted into the PhD program. So I was working full time and doing the PhD on the side.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so I got the PhD in second language acquisition and teaching. But then towards I was there for almost 8 years. And for the most part, I was highly involved in classroom assessment, and then later on in language proficiency testing. And that's how I started getting involved in language proficiency tests. And like, oh, this is very interesting too. And it's like my obvious next step.
Right.
And that's how I ended up here at MLA, because it's like, oh, I wanted to work for an organization that is still tied to a university. I don't want to completely leave academia, so I didn't want to just work for an organization that, one, I didn't believe in, or two, it was just like an industry, like for profit. I didn't want to do that. And so I wanted to work for something that mattered, and I believed in, and that I was still like helping people, from a different perspective a little bit. But
well, we certainly appreciate your research at MLA, and I know it's helping us do wonderful things. So thank you for all that you have done. And thank you for chatting with me about it.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for your flexibility too.
Yeah, no problem.